3 months ago, I begged him to propose. Now, I'm praying he calls off the wedding. The engagement ring felt heavy on my finger as I sat in the parking lot outside the bridal shop, watching rain streak down my windshield. My phone buzzed with another text from Damien asking where I was, why I hadn't come home yet, if I was still mad about last night. I stared at the message until the screen went dark, then started my car and drove in the opposite direction of our apartment. 3 months ago, I would have done anything to get this ring. I'd dropped hints for a year, showed him Pinterest boards of wedding dresses, talked about venues and seasons and color schemes. I'd introduced the topic at family dinners until my mother started giving me pitying looks, and my father changed the subject. When Damien finally proposed on Valentine's Day at that expensive restaurant downtown, I'd cried so hard the other diners applauded. Now I couldn't remember why I'd wanted it so badly. The bruise on my ribs throbbed when I shifted gears, a reminder of last night's argument that had started over dishes and ended with me locked in the bathroom while he punched the door so hard the frame cracked. He'd apologized this morning like he always did, brought me coffee in bed, kissed my forehead, promised it would never happen again. But I'd seen the calculation in his eyes while he said the words, the way he watched to see if I believed him. I'd smiled and nodded because it was easier than fighting, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. The person I'd begged to marry me 3 months ago wasn't the person I was engaged to now. Or maybe he'd always been this person, and I'd been too desperate to see it. My best friend Sienna called as I was pulling into a gas station. I almost didn't answer, but she'd keep calling until I picked up, so I pressed accept and tried to sound normal. Her voice was bright with excitement, asking about the final dress fitting tomorrow, reminding me we needed to confirm numbers with the caterer, wondering if I'd decided on the honeymoon destination yet. The wedding was in 3 weeks, and everyone around me radiated joy while I felt like I was drowning. I told Sienna I'd call her back and hung up before she could ask what was wrong. She'd seen the bruises I'd tried to hide at my bachelorette party last week, the fingerprints on my upper arms from when Damien had grabbed me before I left. She'd asked if everything was okay, and I'd lied smoothly, blamed it on being clumsy, laughed it off. I bought a coffee inside the gas station and sat at one of those small tables near the window, watching cars come and go. A woman with 2 kids in tow struggled with grocery bags while trying to keep her children from running into traffic. An elderly man filled his tank slowly, methodically, like he had all the time in the world. Normal people living normal lives while mine spiraled into something I didn't recognize. My phone buzzed again. Damien asking if I was coming home for dinner, saying he'd picked up ingredients for my favorite pasta, that he missed me. The whiplash between his rage and tenderness used to confuse me into thinking I was the problem. Now I understood it was strategy, keeping me off balance so I never knew which version of him would show up. The first time Damien hit me was 6 weeks after the engagement. We'd been arguing about his ex-girlfriend who kept texting him, and I'd said something about boundaries that made him snap. He'd slapped me across the face so fast I didn't have time to react, then immediately grabbed me and sobbed into my hair, apologizing over and over. I'd stood there frozen, hand on my burning cheek, trying to process what had just happened. He'd never raised a hand to me in the 2 years we'd dated before the engagement. He'd been attentive and romantic, the kind of boyfriend who brought flowers for no reason, and remembered small details I'd mentioned once. But something changed after he put that ring on my finger, like he'd been performing until the deal was sealed. The second time was during a fight about wedding planning. I'd wanted a small ceremony with just close friends and family, but his mother insisted on inviting everyone they'd ever met. When I tried to talk to Damien about compromising, he'd shoved me so hard I'd hit the wall. That time there were no tears, just a cold warning that I needed to stop being difficult, that his mother deserved the wedding she'd dreamed of for her only son. I'd felt something crack inside me that had nothing to do with the physical impact. The man I'd begged to marry me was revealing himself in increments, and each revelation made the previous version feel like a stranger. My phone rang and I saw my mother's name. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message about dress alterations and whether I'd chosen my something borrowed yet. Her voice carried that particular joy mothers have when their daughters are getting married, oblivious to the fact that I was sitting in a gas station planning my escape from the wedding she'd helped organize. I'd tried to tell her once, shown her a bruise on my shoulder, and she'd said all couples fight, that marriage requires compromise, that Damien was a good man with a good job who loved me. The dismissal had hurt worse than the bruise. I drove to Sienna's apartment without deciding to, muscle memory taking over. She opened the door in sweatpants and a ratty college shirt, took one look at my face and pulled me inside without a word. We sat on her couch and I finally said it out loud. I told her everything. The escalating violence, the apologies that meant nothing, the fear that had become my constant companion. I showed her the bruises I'd hidden under long sleeves and strategic makeup. I watched her face go through shock and anger and finally settle on determined focus. She asked what I needed, and I realized I needed someone to help me get out. Sienna called her brother Malik, who was a lawyer, put him on speaker, and I repeated my story to a stranger who asked clinical questions about dates and incidents and evidence. He told me to document everything, take photos of injuries, save threatening texts, and not to let Damien know I was planning to leave. His voice was professional but kind when he said leaving was the most dangerous time, that I needed to be strategic about when and how I disappeared. The word disappeared made it real in a way nothing else had. I wasn't just canceling a wedding, I was fleeing a situation that could kill me if I stayed. We made a plan. Sienna would tell people I was sick with the flu for the next few days, so no one would question why I wasn't answering calls or showing up to wedding appointments. Malik would file for an emergency restraining order and help me get out of the apartment lease. I would slowly move my important documents and belongings to Sienna's place over the next week while Damien was at work. Then, exactly 1 week before the wedding, I would send a single message to Damien calling it off and block him on everything. Malik stressed that I couldn't give him warning or room to negotiate. Just disappear and let the legal system handle communication. Going back to the apartment that night was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Damien was in the kitchen making pasta, humming along to music like nothing had happened, like he hadn't terrified me 12 hours earlier. He smiled when I walked in and asked about my day, served me wine, acted like the man I'd fallen for. I played along because I had to, laughed at his jokes and pretended everything was fine. But I'd already started the mental process of separating myself from him, and every word felt like reading lines from a script. Over the next 3 days, I moved things systematically. A box of photos while he was in the shower, my grandmother's jewelry when he went for a run, important documents from the filing cabinet during his poker night. Each item I smuggled out felt like stealing pieces of my own life back. Sienna stored everything in her spare room and sent me photos so I'd know it was safe. The wedding dress still hung in our closet, a white ghost mocking me every time I opened the door. I wondered what Damien would do when he found it abandoned, whether he'd destroy it or try to return it to punish me financially. Malik called on day 4 with news that the restraining order had been approved. A judge had reviewed my photos and testimony and deemed me credible enough to grant protection. The order would be served to Damien the same day I sent the breakup message, ensuring he couldn't contact me to manipulate or threaten his way back in. Knowing there would be legal consequences if he came near me made breathing slightly easier. Sienna had already changed her locks and installed a doorbell camera just in case he figured out where I was staying. On day 5, Damien asked why I seemed distant. We were watching TV and I'd been lost in thought about logistics instead of paying attention to the show. He turned off the television and said I'd been acting strange all week, wanted to know if I was having second thoughts about the wedding. The irony of the question almost made me laugh. I forced myself to look him in the eyes and lie, told him I was just stressed about all the planning, that I loved him and couldn't wait to be his wife. He studied my face for a long moment before smiling and pulling me close. His arms around me felt like a cage instead of comfort. That night, he initiated sex, and I went through the motions while feeling completely detached from my body. Afterward, he fell asleep immediately while I stared at the ceiling planning my escape. 4 more days and I'd be free. 4 more days of pretending. 4 more days of being afraid in my own home. I cataloged the remaining items I needed to take. My laptop, certain books, the quilt my grandmother made me before she died. Everything else could be replaced. Material things didn't matter anymore. Only getting out mattered. Day 6 brought an unexpected complication. Damien's mother Vivian called and insisted on meeting for lunch to discuss final wedding details. I couldn't refuse without raising suspicion, so I met her at an upscale restaurant downtown where she'd reserved a table by the window. She was already seated when I arrived, perfectly dressed as always, smiling that smile that never reached her eyes. We'd never gotten along despite my best efforts. She found me lacking in ways she never explicitly stated, just implied through comments about my job, my clothes, my family. Vivian started by showing me photos of centerpieces and asking my opinion, but I could tell she'd already decided and was just going through the motions of including me. Then she shifted to talking about marriage, about how wives need to understand their role, about how her generation knew how to keep a man happy. The subtext was clear. She'd noticed tension between Damien and me and was warning me to fall in line. I wanted to show her the bruises her son had left, to ask if keeping a man happy meant letting him use me as a punching bag. Instead, I smiled and nodded and said all the right things while rage simmered under my skin. She mentioned Damien had always been sensitive, that he needed a strong woman who could handle his moods. The way she said it made my blood run cold. She knew. She'd probably always known what he was capable of and had spent his whole life making excuses for him. I wondered how many other women had sat across from her receiving this same coded warning, how many had married into this family and suffered in silence because speaking up meant going against someone who'd already decided you were the problem. I finished lunch as quickly as possible and left feeling dirty, like I'd been complicit in my own abuse by not calling her out. That evening, Damien was in a good mood. He'd gotten a promotion at work and wanted to celebrate, took me to an expensive restaurant and ordered champagne. I watched him charm the waitress and joke with the bartender, saw how easily he performed normalcy for strangers. This was the version of him everyone else knew, the successful, charismatic man who seemed like such a catch. They didn't see what happened behind closed doors when I disappointed him or questioned him or simply existed in a way that triggered his rage. I drank the champagne and smiled and felt nothing. On the drive home, he talked about the future, about the promotion, meaning we could afford a bigger house, about trying for kids right after the honeymoon, about the life we'd build together. Every word was a horror show. The idea of being trapped in a house with him, of bringing children into this nightmare, of being legally and financially bound in ways that made leaving even harder, made me want to jump out of the moving car. I'd almost married this man without seeing what he really was, or I'd seen it and convinced myself it wasn't that bad, that I could fix him, that my love would be enough to make him change. The delusion felt embarrassing in retrospect. Day 7 arrived with ominous weather, dark clouds, and the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Damien left for work early for a meeting, kissing me goodbye at the door like he had every right to my body and my time. The moment his car pulled out of the parking lot, I called Sienna. She arrived with her brother's truck, and we spent 3 hours clearing out everything I'd left behind. Clothes, books, kitchen items I'd bought, furniture I'd had before we moved in together. We moved with efficient silence, loading the truck while I kept checking my phone, expecting Damien to come home early and catch us. The apartment looked empty when we finished, stripped of my presence in a way that felt both sad and liberating. I'd spent 2 years building a life in this space, and now I was erasing myself from it in a single morning. The only thing left was the wedding dress hanging in the closet like a ghost of who I'd almost become. I pulled it down carefully, folded it into the garment bag, and carried it out. Sienna raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. I'd paid for the dress with my own money, and I'd be damned if I left it behind for him to destroy or mock or turn into another weapon against me. We drove to Sienna's apartment in 2 trips, unloading everything into her spare room until it looked like a storage unit. She made us lunch while I sat at her kitchen table feeling numb. It was done. I'd left. All that remained was sending the message tomorrow, 1 week before the wedding, exactly as Malik had instructed. Sienna asked if I wanted to draft it now, get it ready so I didn't have to think about it in the moment. We spent an hour crafting the perfect message. Brief, clear, final. No room for negotiation or questions. Just a statement that the wedding was canceled and I was ending the relationship, followed by information about the restraining order and warning him not to contact me. That night, I slept at Sienna's place for the first time as a free woman. The guest bed was comfortable and the room was quiet, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Damien coming home to an empty apartment, seeing my things gone, realizing I'd left. Would he be angry? Sad? Would he even care beyond the embarrassment of having to cancel the wedding? Part of me worried he'd figure out where I was, but Malik had assured me the restraining order would protect me. Still, I lay awake listening to every sound outside, half expecting to hear Damien's voice demanding I come out. Morning arrived gray and cold. I checked my phone and saw 17 missed calls from Damien, texts asking where I was, where my things were, what was happening. He'd come home to the empty apartment and panicked. Good. Let him feel a fraction of the fear I'd lived with for months. Sienna made coffee while I read through his messages, watching his tone shift from confused to angry to desperate. The final text said he knew I was planning something, that I'd regret leaving him, that I was making a huge mistake. The threat was implicit but clear. At exactly 9 in the morning, I sent the message, kept my finger on the send button for a moment before committing, then watched it turn from delivered to read. Within seconds, my phone exploded with calls. I blocked his number like Malik had instructed, then blocked him on every social media platform, every messaging app, every possible avenue of contact. Sienna's phone started ringing immediately after. Damien calling her, probably screaming about where I was. She declined and blocked him too. Then my mother called, then my father, then 3 different bridesmaids. Word was spreading fast. I turned off my phone and sat in Sienna's living room feeling like I'd detonated a bomb in my own life. The wedding was supposed to be in 7 days. Invitations had been sent, deposits paid, flights booked. Hundreds of people were expecting to watch me marry Damien, and instead they'd get a cancellation notice. The embarrassment should have bothered me more than it did, but all I felt was relief. Overwhelming, exhausting relief that I wouldn't have to walk down that aisle and legally bind myself to someone who hurt me. Malik called in the afternoon to confirm the restraining order had been served. A sheriff's deputy had gone to Damien's office and handed him the paperwork in front of his colleagues, making it very public and very official. Malik said Damien had tried to argue, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, but the deputy had simply given him the documents and left. He was now legally prohibited from contacting me, coming within 500 feet of me, or attempting to communicate through third parties. Violating the order would mean arrest and criminal charges. My mother showed up at Sienna's apartment that evening. I don't know how she found out where I was, but she was pounding on the door demanding to be let in. Sienna looked at me for permission, and I nodded, bracing myself. My mother came in looking furious and devastated in equal measure. She wanted to know what I'd done, why I'd canceled the wedding, what had happened to make me throw away a good man. I pulled up my sleeve and showed her the bruises I'd been hiding. Showed her the photos on my phone documenting months of abuse. Showed her the medical records from the urgent care visit after he'd shoved me into a table and I'd needed stitches. She went silent, staring at the evidence like it was written in a foreign language. Then she started crying, apologizing for not seeing it, for not believing me when I'd tried to tell her before. She pulled me into a hug, and I felt something break open inside me. All the fear and anger and sadness I'd been holding back flooding out. We sat on Sienna's couch while I sobbed into my mother's shoulder, and she rocked me like I was a child again. When I finally calmed down, she said she'd handle telling the family, canceling vendors, dealing with the logistics. All I had to do was focus on staying safe. Over the next few days, my phone stayed off while the world dealt with the fallout of my canceled wedding. Sienna updated me periodically. My father had apparently gone to Damien's apartment and had words that resulted in Damien agreeing to move out and break the lease. Several bridesmaids had called Sienna saying they'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't wanted to interfere. Damien's mother had sent a vicious email to my mother calling me a liar and attention seeker, which my mother had apparently responded to with photographic evidence that shut her up. The venue, the caterer, the photographer all received cancellation notices. Money was lost, but I didn't care. You can't put a price on safety. 3 days after I sent the breakup message, Damien violated the restraining order. He showed up at my workplace, waiting in the parking lot even though the order specifically prohibited him from coming anywhere near my job. A coworker spotted him and called the police while I hid in my office with the door locked. I heard sirens and shouting, then silence. Malik called 20 minutes later to say Damien had been arrested for violating the order and was being held pending a hearing. The violation would be added to his record and likely result in an extension of the order and possible jail time. I felt vindicated and terrified simultaneously. He couldn't follow one simple rule, couldn't leave me alone even when legally ordered to. What would he have done if we'd gotten married? The hearing happened a week later. I had to appear via video conference to testify about the violation. Damien sat next to his lawyer looking furious, and when the judge asked if he'd been at my workplace on the date in question, he claimed he'd just wanted to talk, to understand why I was doing this to him. The prosecutor presented security footage showing him sitting in his car watching the building entrance for over an hour. The judge was not impressed. She extended the restraining order to 2 years and sentenced him to 30 days in jail for the violation, stating that his complete disregard for court orders and victim safety warranted immediate consequences. Watching him be led out of the courtroom in handcuffs felt surreal. 3 months ago, I'd begged this man to propose. Now he was going to jail because he couldn't accept that I'd left. The trajectory of our relationship felt like something from a movie, too dramatic to be my real life. But it was real. The bruises were real. The fear was real. And so was my freedom now, protected by legal documents and consequences that had teeth. My wedding day arrived sunny and beautiful. The day I was supposed to be getting married instead, I was at Sienna's apartment wearing pajamas and eating ice cream while we watched terrible reality TV. My phone buzzed occasionally with messages from relatives offering support and asking if I needed anything. The bridesmaids group chat had dissolved into individual friendships, some of them reaching out to maintain contact, while others had clearly sided with Damien. I learned quickly who my real friends were. The wedding dress still hung in Sienna's spare room closet, too expensive to abandon but painful to look at. She suggested we do something dramatic with it, maybe burn it or paint it black or cut it up for art. Instead, I donated it to a charity that provided wedding dresses to low-income brides. Let it bring someone else joy instead of representing my nightmare. The shop called a week later to say a bride had chosen it and cried when she tried it on because she never thought she could afford something so beautiful. That call made me cry too, but in a good way. Months passed and I slowly rebuilt my life. Therapy helped process the trauma and identify the red flags I'd missed. My therapist, Dr. Pascal, explained how abusers often wait until their victims are committed before revealing their true nature, how the engagement had likely triggered Damien's escalation because he felt he'd secured me. Understanding the psychology didn't make it hurt less, but it helped me stop blaming myself for not seeing it sooner. No one enters a relationship expecting to be abused. The manipulation is designed to be invisible until it's too late. I moved into my own apartment 6 months after leaving Damien. Small but mine, with locks only I had keys to and space that belonged entirely to me. Sienna helped me decorate, picking out furniture and plants and art that reflected who I was becoming instead of who I'd been. We painted the living room a soft blue that made me feel calm, hung photos of friends and family, created a space that felt safe. The first night alone there, I slept better than I had in years. Damien got out of jail and immediately started a smear campaign on social media, posted long rants about crazy exes and false accusations, painted himself as the victim of a vindictive woman who couldn't handle commitment. His friends shared the posts and added their own commentary about women who use restraining orders as weapons. I watched it happen from the safety of blocked accounts, friends sending me screenshots. My first instinct was to defend myself publicly, to share the evidence and the truth. Malik advised against it. Let him show everyone who he really is, he said. People who matter will see through it. He was right. Damien's rants got increasingly unhinged, and people started questioning his version of events. Former coworkers came forward with stories about his temper at work. An ex-girlfriend from college posted about her own experience with his violence. The narrative he was trying to control slipped through his fingers as more truth emerged. I stayed silent and let the truth speak for itself. By the time he deleted all the posts, the damage to his reputation was done. A year after leaving, I ran into Vivian at a grocery store. We made eye contact across the produce section, and I watched her face cycle through recognition, shame, and anger. She walked over despite my body language screaming, "Leave me alone." She wanted to tell me her side, wanted me to know Damien had always been a good boy, that I'd ruined his life. I interrupted her mid-sentence and said clearly, loudly, that her son had hit me repeatedly, and that she'd known and done nothing. Other shoppers turned to stare. She went pale and left without another word. I finished my shopping with hands that shook, but a spine that felt stronger. Dating again felt impossible at first. The idea of trusting someone with my heart after what Damien had done seemed absurd. But Dr. Pascal worked with me on recognizing healthy relationship dynamics, on understanding that not everyone was dangerous, on learning to trust my instincts instead of ignoring red flags. When I eventually started dating again 2 years after leaving, I was hyper-aware of every interaction, analyzing every word and gesture for signs of control or manipulation. It was exhausting, but necessary. I wasn't going to ignore warning signs again. I met Oliver at a work conference. He was funny and smart and patient when I told him about my past. Didn't push for more than I was comfortable giving. We took things slowly, let trust build naturally instead of rushing toward commitment. When he eventually met my family and friends, they all approved in that way that meant they'd been worried about me ever since Damien. Oliver understood boundaries and respected them, never made me feel trapped or controlled. It was shocking how different a healthy relationship felt after living through abuse. 3 years after leaving Damien, I was finally ready to think about marriage again. Oliver proposed on a quiet Sunday morning in our apartment. No grand gestures or public pressure, just him asking if I wanted to build a life together. I said yes without hesitation, but insisted on a long engagement to make sure we were both certain. We planned a small wedding with close friends and family, nothing like the elaborate event I'd almost had with Damien. Sienna was my maid of honor, of course. She'd saved my life that day in her apartment when I'd finally asked for help. The wedding was simple and perfect. My father walked me down the aisle and my mother cried happy tears. Sienna stood beside me grinning like a fool, and Oliver waited at the altar looking at me like I was exactly what he wanted, not a prize he'd won or a possession he'd acquired. When we said our vows, I meant every word. This was what marriage was supposed to be. Partnership, respect, genuine love without fear. The reception was low-key and joyful, full of people who'd supported me through the worst time of my life and were now celebrating the best. On my honeymoon, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, desperate for an engagement, blind to warning signs, convinced that marriage to Damien would complete me. That version of myself felt like a stranger now. I'd learned the hard way that sometimes the things we beg for would destroy us if we got them. Leaving had felt like giving up on my dreams at the time, but I'd been giving up on a nightmare dressed as a dream. The real dream was this: safety, respect, actual love, worth every difficult moment of getting here.